So in this next section, we want to talk about strategies for influencing policy. So as we've recognized, there is a lack of movement from evidence to policy. Now, how can we improve that? How can we make our research findings, our research evidence become utilized for policy and implemented through decision making by policymakers, by senior officials, by donors, by funding agencies, and so this is what we want to talk about. Now, Oxfam GB have a study that they published that we talked about earlier, and what that study does is it looks at strategies for influencing policy, and they identify a number of strategies. And one of the strategies that they identify is to learn how policy making works. So it's important as a development practitioner to not only know what you do and your work environment, but also to know the policy making environment. Now, the policy making environment is usually far removed from your day-to-day work. So it's important to know how that environment works. It's important to know who the players are in the policy making process. It's important to know who the decision makers are. It's important to know the power structures, the hierarchy, the influence, and all of that. So learning how a political system works and how a policy system works is important in order to understand who to talk to and in what form can you communicate. What's the most effective way? What is the most effective way to communicate your research findings? So learning how policymaking works is an important first step to engaging those policymakers and persuasively communicating your research findings in order to draw attention to your findings in order that they may be implemented. So the second step is to identify a specific audience and then design a tailor-made message for that audience. So usually research is done in a very technical way, evaluations are done in a very specific way, but it's important to then tailor make those findings depending on your audience. So it's the same report, it's the same findings, but they have to be repackaged depending on the audience that you're talking to. So designing, framing, timing, and adapting your evidence to a particular audience is very important in influencing the target audience. Now, another strategy is to use additional ways to influence your policy audience. So those additional ways could be things like integrating your research findings, which is your main thing, right? Your research findings, to integrate that with a wider set of strategies. So, for example, involving the relevant stakeholders who may be decision makers, and also involving stakeholders who are sort of at the local level, and also framing your message and your research and timing how it's released. So it's a combination of these different strategies, right, in order to make maximum impact. And then the fourth strategy is to embrace a trial and error approach. It's basically acknowledging that things may not work the first time. Your efforts to engage policymakers and decision makers may not work the first time, so you kind of take a trial and error approach. You try one approach, and if it doesn't work, you don't stop. You try again, you repackage your message, and maybe you start off with a briefing note, and if that doesn't bring traction, well, you publish something. It could be an opinion or editorial piece. It could be a highlight or on a certain platform where policymakers read, and so things like that. You just try a combination of different approaches. Or maybe you try to engage the highest decision makers, but then you didn't get an opportunity. Well, you can sort of scale it down and go to the lower level decision making and engage people at that level. And once you gain traction there, it can open up opportunities to speak to the higher level decision makers. And also understanding that that process can be long, because in the policy making world, things can just be slow, right? Because of the different things, because of the bureaucracy, because of some of the political things, and so on. And as an economist who also has the opportunity to work for a government, I have this first-hand experience that as I generate evidence and research, how I communicate that evidence has to be in a strategic way in order to influence decision makers, to bring attention to important things, right, in my research. So this is a skill that I've had to develop so that I'm not just focusing on the technical aspects of my work, but also the understanding the policy making process. So this is very important to have and to be very intentional about it. Now, there's some specific strategies that Oxfam identifies, and they identify some guidelines for communicating depending on the audience that you're communicating with. They identify different types of audiences and then the different types of communication strategies that you can use depending on the audience that you're talking to. So the first audience are elected policymakers. So these are your elected officials, your politicians. Well, the evidence that they may respond to best is things which are presented in a big picture way. So big ideas, compelling stories, this positive vision casting of what your findings are presenting. So that's the strategy there. And then another audience is civil servants. With civil servants will respond best to communication which is objective, which is rigorous, which uses credible methodology, which uses technical details, and so on. And then the other audience is corporate executives. So corporate executives will respond best to information that's company specific, findings which are company specific, because they want to know how your findings affect their operations, how your findings affect their work, their business. So you tailor make your findings to make them company specific. They will also respond to communication which is based on credible methodology. So it's important to point out and emphasize the credibility of your methodology, because they need to trust your work. They need to trust the rigor of your work. And then another audience are communities. Now, these are your local communities, and communities will respond to community-focused messaging which is generated with their participation. So, for example, you could have maybe you're presenting findings based on research that you conducted in the community. Well, when you go back to present to that community, the community will respond. They're likely to respond more, because they feel they are a part of the process. And I know with previous research that I've been involved with, we've gone back to the communities to present our findings, present our learnings, get their feedback, and it's very effective to get the people engaged. Then another audience is activists and public attitudes and beliefs, and they respond to facts, they'll respond to messaging which shows clear impacts. And then the final audience is the media. The media will respond to messaging which is new, which has a human face to the story, which is based on facts, and sometimes even evidence that's controversial. It makes the news, right? So that's how you can package your findings in order to maximize the utilization of those findings depending on your audience. So these are some of the strategies that can help alleviate this problem of a low uptake of research outputs.